So we were picking up right in the middle of this epic battle.
Utter desperation at his lack of reinforcements, Frederick ordered 67-year-old General Peter von Pinnevel to launch a cavalry charge. They advanced past Brezat before being mauled by heavy artillery fire and a subsequent cavalry counterattack. Despite the casualties, at around 7 p.m., Moritz's infantry reached the top of the Cäsar's Hill. The subsequent close combat appeared to favor the Prussians. Another charge launched by Bevern pushed into the Austrian left flank, on top of the Psarowski. Then on the far left of the Prussians, Major General Christian von Krosigk launched a charge against the village.
Everyone said to go to a traditional
The
university.
combination of the sudden momentum, the Prussian advance, and the Austrians running out of ammunition and wavering lines made it seem like Prussia was about to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat.
Okay, the way he says it seems like I'm imagining now that the Austrians are about to pull off some type of maneuver to quickly reverse this fortune. Because this is actually incredibly well done. Like, I have to say, the fact that the Prussians showed up here were caught completely off guard. Frederick's original flanking maneuver, oldest trick in the book, completely failed, and he got essentially thrown into a fight that he realized that it's really bad. So in desperation, he just made everyone go for it and start fighting. All of that, and to still be winning. Again, I think I'm gonna give credit a lot to the quality of the Prussian soldiers. Again, famed for their discipline, famed for their ability to just keep fighting. It seems like once again the Prussian discipline is carrying the fight right now. But we're gonna see what Dune has to how he's gonna retaliate.
It would not have been the first time, but it just wasn't enough. Krosigk was struck by a cannonball, dying on impact. Fighting continued for a while, but the brigade began wavering before cracking and scattering. Pennever's damaged cavalry retreated to the Imperial Road. The Prussian infantry was exhausted and battered. Whenever they made an opening in the Austrian lines, it was filled with fresh reserves. Finally, the late Krosigk's cavalry suffered heavy counterattacks.
Oh, yes, the hidden cavalry contingent. It seems like they're about to pull off a flanking maneuver. Oldest trick in the book.
Much more numerous Austrian cavalry stationed near the Eichenwald. Bevern's infantry suffered heavy casualties, battered by the artillery and infantry on the hill. Some sources indicate Bevern managed to scale the hill and line up his army. But the flanking of the Netherlands Union Dragoon Regiment from the left crushed his infantry, and they retreated to the Imperial Road. On the left, the Austrian cavalry surrounded the Prussian vanguard. Breshkov was wounded and captured, together with his infantry. At around 8 p.m., the Prussians retreated. Zieten and Hülsen maintained order among their troops, preventing Dawn from following up the victory with a chase. Colin's score was gruesome. The Prussian army received an enormous blow. Of their infantry, 8,755 were killed or missing, 3,568 were wounded. Of the cavalry, 1,450 men and even more horses were killed. To put this into perspective, over a third of the troops deployed became a casualty statistic. They lost an additional 5,380 men as POWs. Dawn lost 8,114 soldiers, most of whom were wounded, totaling about 15% of the troops deployed. The Austrians camped on the field, a classic sign of victory.
Dawn. Okay, so that's good. He was building up Dawn there, and now I can exactly see why he was hyping up Dawn. Dawn, who has faced Frederick before, seems to, though it does seem like Frederick kind of just waltzed into that battle and into a position which was not favorable, and you can kind of see the desperation as he was caught in a bad position, just throwing everything he had essentially. But Dawn seemed to use his cavalry and reserves much better and more opportune times. So once again, like, man, like even this is a time where even the famed Prussian war machine discipline could not overcome. And yeah, the thing is, though, Frederick, the thing is, he needs to move quick. He's fighting multiple enemies. Right now, he's just dealing with the Austrians, but the French are seemingly gonna join in any minute. The Russians want to jump him. Like, he doesn't really have time to lick his wounds as much, you know? He's essentially is fighting a coalition. And I don't know about how much manpower he has, but like, he's losing a lot of guys too. Like, his casualties, even in his victories, are Pyrrhic. So that's kind of the problem, though. It's like, can he even sustain a long-lasting war? The thing with Napoleon is the French, at least at the time of Napoleon, had like were second to Russia in terms of just manpower that they could levy. I don't know about the Prussian manpower, though. How much troops they can just keep spawning, especially when facing so many enemies. So yeah, I'm a little worried for Freddy. Granted, I like how I'm saying all this knowing how it all ends, but you know what? Let's ignore that. Let's just focus on the journey, even though I know how everything ends. You know, it's still fun to see the journey, right?
When news of the victory reached Vienna, the city burst into spontaneous celebration. Maria Theresa created the eponymous order, awarding Dawn the first Grand Cross. Allegorical works were written and the Pope conferred his indescribable jubilation. As you can imagine, the mood in Berlin stood in stark contrast to these jubilations. After nearly 2 decades of incredible successes, this defeat served as a cold shower to the Prussians. Tim Blenning writes, "In just a few hours, Frederick lost more than a battle. His superhuman reputation had collapsed." Austrian memoirs reveal how their opinion of Prussian soldiers shifted. It turned out they could be made to flee. In a letter to Marshal Keith, Frederick conceded he had tried to do too much with too few. He became depressed and disillusioned, ordering Prince Henry to prepare to lift the siege of Prague. His cynic wit shows in one of his letters, "Success breeds overconfidence, and the next time I will do better. Every man must have his setbacks, and it seems I shall have mine."
It's true, Frederick. That's a great attitude to have, because you know what? Sometimes we may be on a streak of successes, but then life will always find a way to even humble the most successful people, and therein lies the problem. You know, you either keep going, or you give up, but like, setbacks, what separates some people from others is that when you face setbacks, it's like the saying, it isn't so much, man, I'm always tripping on my word. It's how you face your failures and setbacks, which will determine your future success. And, you know, even the greatest people, except maybe Alexander, had setbacks. No, I'm joking. But, you know, point is, even the greats have had setbacks and losses, but they did not let that define them. They immediately got back on the horse, and they immediately went back to the grind. And Frederick seems to at least have that mindset, so that's good.
In his political testament, written 11 years after the battle, Frederick wrote how if they had won at Kolin, the Austrian army in Prague would have had to capitulate, the French army would not have crossed the Rhine, the Russians would have stayed at home, and Austria would have had to make peace on Prussian terms. Blenning remarks very much to the point. In the event, the opposites of those things happened, and with them, the defeat transformed the very nature of the war. Frederick's war was about to turn into a war of attrition, and his enemies were more than ready to capitalize on the Austrian success.
A war of attrition. But can Frederick even sustain a long-lasting war against multiple
enemies? In the summer of
enemies?
1757, Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, received barely, if any, positive news about the progress of the ongoing war. The defeat at Kolin in June put a considerable dent in the Prussian war machine. Frederick raised the siege of Prague and debated on what to do. Initially, he wanted to retreat to Saxony, but he tried to maintain much of his conquered Bohemian territory instead. He divided his army into 2 equal parts. At Leitmeritz, Frederick commanded some 34,000 soldiers. His brother August Wilhelm commanded an equal number of men to his east. These fed off the magazine at Zittau in Upper Lusatia. Frederick told him it was of vital importance to defend the supply depots and entrances into Silesia. Meanwhile, irregulars under Nadashdy and Beck infested the main roads and villages around the frontier. Frederick spent some of his most unhappy days in the palace at Leitmeritz. On June 28, news reached him of his mother's death. When he found out, he wrote to his sister Wilhelmine, "All misfortunes overwhelm me at the same time. This loss is the culmination of my sorrows, and yet I am forced to act, and I do not have time to give full course to my tears. All the losses in this world may be redressed, but those occasioned by death are beyond remedy."
That sucks. Poor Frederick, man. You know, losing your mom. I couldn't imagine, you know, going through that. Especially in such an awful time, just everything falling apart. But he's gonna be strong, you know? But man, that sucks. Poor guy.
He indeed did not have time to grieve. In Bohemia, 110,000 Austrians were ready to advance. To his east, 100,000 Russians under Field Marshal Stepan Apraksin moved against his duchy. To his west, 125,000 French were becoming a significant danger for his Hanoverian allies. Under Prince de Soubise, they already conquered Prussia's clave possessions, and a 70,000-strong army under Count d'Estrées now directed their march against Hanover. And to
How much worse can it get?
top it all off, another army, the 40,000-strong Reichsexecution-Armee, consisting of imperial soldiers commanded by Field Marshal Prince Joseph von Sachsen-Hildburghausen, were on the move to link up with the French.
Oh my goodness, dude, he's surrounded. The fact that he makes it through is insane, but how? Like, you need to take them, again, we've seen with coalition forces, the best way to deal with them, divide and conquer. Take on one, move on to the other, but right now he's struggling with just Austria. Like, how's he gonna get Austria off the table, or get any of them off the table? Like, these numbers suck. You know, these odds.
Through diplomacy, Prussia continued attempting to establish peace with France, to no avail. Worrisome news from Sweden reached Frederick as well.
Oh yeah,
They were
Sweden.
preparing an invasion force to seize Pomerania. It wouldn't be until September 13 till they landed, but it opened another front. Three main fronts opened: the south around Silesia and Saxony against the Austrians, the west against the French and Imperial Army, the east against the Russians. Facing over 400,000 hostile troops, Frederick amassed no more than 154,000 soldiers.
Yeah, the only benefit he has right now is that they're not all there already, and they're not all linked up. Oh, boy.
Up to 64,000 were stationed on the Bohemian frontier against the Austrians. 10,000 remained in Brandenburg as reserves defending the capital and Pomerania. No more than 30,000 were dispatched to East Prussia under 70-year-old Field Marshal Hans von Lewald. An additional 50.
There's so many old freaking Prussian commanders so far in this series, like 67-year-olds, 80-year-olds. Granted though, what's the saying? You should fear an old man in a profession where, you know, young men die, something like that. It's from that, you know what I'm talking about. My brain is farting right now. But, point is, yeah, no offense, we do like old, awesome, old commanders, but it's just, I kind of worry because they're old in their health, you know. Granted though, I imagine they're probably more healthy than most, you know, I imagine a more active lifestyle in the past, especially with all the movement and whatnot, but still though.
54,000 soldiers, although many of them were British and Hanoverian, served under the Duke of Cumberland against the advancing French and Imperial Army. The first action occurred on the Bohemian front. Contrary to Frederick's expectations, the Austrians focused their assault to the east against August Wilhelm's army. This was entirely unexpected, and it showed. On July 15, the Austrians under Duke Arenberg seized Gabel, capturing Puttkamer. August Wilhelm was outmaneuvered. The Austrians continued with a vengeance, and 8 days later, they fell onto Zittau. Just like that,
Say hello to our world.
Seized a depot which could have sustained 40,000 soldiers for a month. Again, a massive blow to Prussia. The Austrians used Zittau as a springboard to launch raids into Silesia throughout the summer. August Wilhelm retreated to the west with a highly demoralized army, suffering continued attacks by irregulars. His poor, managed retreat left the path to Silesia wide open. Bad news continued. 3 days after Zittau, a French army under Marshal d'Estrées defeated the Duke of Cumberland's army at Hastenbeck. Negotiations between the French and Hanover opened. This worried Frederick. The withdrawal from Hanover, and thus Great Britain, from the war would severely weaken Prussia's western frontier. Additionally, a French army under Marshal Soubise, stationed in Strasbourg, preyed on the Prussians. The king met his brother at Bautzen. After the meeting, the prince reportedly departed in tears. A surviving letter Frederick sent to him does not leave much to the imagination. You make me pay a high price for the confidence I reposed in you. Never again will you, August Wilhelm, command another army to ruin. To my way of thinking, your splendid expedition was nothing more than the impulse from some superannuated, spoiled child from whom we take a knife lest he should cut himself and injure others. The prince and his generals deserve to be sentenced to death by court-martial, but his position prevents this.
Dang, Freddy. Man, that sucks. But it's true, like, every mistake is catastrophic towards the Prussians. I can understand his frustration, but yeah, I feel bad. I'd leave in tears too. You kidding me, man? Just go away. Just never show my face again. Oh man.
August Wilhelm resigned from the army not soon after. He passed away, likely from a cerebral hemorrhage, before the animosity between the brothers could be resolved. In the wake of his retreat, Frederick,
man, all these familiar losses,
traveled to Silesia to reassemble his army north of Zittau. He commanded some 65,000 men. Primary sources conflict about the army's state. Some mention the army being re-energized thanks to the king's presence. Others mention it was demoralized. Prince Henry supposedly talked the king out of several near-suicidal attacks against the Austrians during these days. Heeding Henry's advice, Frederick returned to Dresden with 25,000 soldiers to take stock. He ordered Bevern at Gorlitz to defend Silesia with some 40,000 men. General Winterfeld was assigned to assist Bevern. Frederick concluded the most dangerous problems was the French. They even refused his peace offerings, promising millions of thalers as indemnity. Likely because Madame de Pompadour, the French king's mistress, had a strong dislike for Frederick. The feeling was mutual. But to his
why is Frederick beefing with all the women in this series? You notice, like, the Tsaress, Elizabeth, Maria of Austria, and now the frickin' Frederick women don't seem to like Frederick that much, eh? He's like beefing with all of them.
East, trouble continued brewing. General Beck, Nadashti, and Arenberg, among many other Austrian commanders, roamed the frontier. One of these commanders frequently raiding Silesia was Colonel Janusz von Eberstadt. Already in early July, he captured Landeshut, although some sources indicate he captured it as late as August 10. But Landeshut too became a hub for irregular incursions against Silesia. Prussian scouts relayed this information to Major General Johann Friedrich von Kreitzen, stationed nearby. The general now set out to surprise Janus and expel him from his stronghold. After weeks of maneuvering around each other, Kreitzen finally decided to mount an assault against the stronghold. Although Prussian reconnaissance was poor, Kreitzen rightly suspected Janus outnumbered him. Unfortunately, sources aren't very detailed about the number of units involved. Kreitzen commanded some 3,000 soldiers. Janus commanded some 4,000. Many of them were Croat irregulars, and many of them were cavalry. Kreitzen devised a plan to expel Janus from Landeshut without engaging in any large-scale battle, by surprising him. On August 12, his army set out to march from the northeast towards Vogelsdorf, a village to the north of Landeshut. After a night of marching, Kreitzen arrived at Vogelsdorf. Far in this vanguard, his hussars ran into several light Grenzer troops roaming the forest. It soon became clear the Prussians were outnumbered, and after a brief skirmish, the hussars retreated to relay their findings to Kreitzen. The Austrian light infantry continued roaming around the Buchberg forest. The Grenzer outposts roaming the forest prevented the Prussian troops from moving past Vogelsdorf and locating the main Austrian encampment. Only thanks to some campfires burning south of Landeshut near the Kirchberg could they roughly pinpoint Janus's position. Despite having marched all night and day and having incomplete information, Kreitzen decided to mount an attack that evening. He hoped his army would swiftly get rid of the light infantry on the Buchberg, while the rest captured Landeshut to secure a stronghold against Janus's main army. The march commenced at 7 p.m. Unfortunately for Kreitzen, he misjudged the time it took to reach.
Yeah, so far he's making some errors. Obviously, he's not fully aware with the reconnaissance of what's going on. And here, like, he's just hoping to move quicker. But yeah, it seems like he's making some rash decisions at the moment. Some understandable, but yeah, I'm not sure of. You know what I really like about learning about the Prussians? They make mistakes. They make mistakes, but it also makes it impressive in how much they manage to pull through despite their mistakes. You know what I mean? Kind of like a bit of luck, but also due to their famed discipline and prowess that often more than not seems to get them out of sticky situations. I mean, we'll see if it works this time, but yeah.
Reached the Buchberg. When night fell, he had to order his army to halt because they could not correctly assess the enemy's positions. The Prussian position was an incredibly dangerous one. Amidst the meadows and fields with barely any cover, Kreitzen ordered his army in a large square, protecting his baggage train. Behind them stood the hussars, ready to use their agility in battle. During this rather clumsy advance by the Prussians, Janus had been well aware of their movements.
There's DIY, and there's doing.
The complete lack of interaction by his soldiers, however, for a good reason. As night fell and the Prussians formed an infantry square, Janus sent agile light infantry detachments to harass the Prussian flanks. Then, with his main army south of Landeshut, Janus began moving towards Kreitzen's southeast. Amidst the darkness, suddenly Prussian soldiers were picked up one by one.
Yeah, it seems like this ain't going so well for the Prussians. Man, I've never seen the Austrians so formidable. I think mainly because we've only ever seen the Austrians in the Napoleonic Wars and after, where they're kind of just floundering the entire time. But I must say that, you know, like, they are such a threat, at least in terms of their military. Sure, they've suffered L's, but they've also been giving a good fight back towards the you know, Prussians. So like I said, it's so weird to see them being so formidable, you know.
Parts of the Prussian formation became chaotic, firing at random. The general staff reports of the battle mention multiple friendly fire casualties. During these hours of chaos, horses broke loose with Janus's men capturing at least 30. In addition, around 100 Saxons forcibly enlisted in the Prussian army decided this was a splendid time to desert. Amidst the darkness and chaos in front of the Buchberg, Janus reached the forest. His army deployed in the tree line, including at least 6 heavy guns. Kreitzen realized he was in danger in the valley, although he likely was unaware of Janus's real movements. As the Austrians took their positions, Kreitzen ordered his army to retreat to Vogelsdorf while maintaining their square formation. The supply wagons heavily impeded their movement speed. By this point, dawn was setting in. When the first rays of sun illuminated the plain, Janus saw the Prussians haphazardly retreating. He ordered his artillery and infantry to open fire. The quiet morning was polluted by sounds of heavy artillery fire as the shells struck the ground around the Prussians. Sources indicate the accuracy was nothing to write home about, and the artillery inflicted barely any casualties. But it did ensure complete panic in the Prussian lines and the abandonment of their entire baggage train.
Wow.
Disregarding the misfortune, Keitel managed to rally his men within the valley. He ordered his infantry in a straight line. Janusz deployed his infantry in a similar fashion, resulting in 2 infantry lines running parallel to each other. Keitel was the first to order the
He's going for it, isn't he? I thought he would have like tried to get completely away, but he's going for a fight, even though I think this is the worst position to be in. Wow. Okay, brave, certainly, but like I said, he's so far been caught off guard a lot, and yeah, things don't look well. That's all I'll say. I don't know if this will end up somehow turning out well, but so far, not looking good.
general attack. His infantry moved forward against the Austrian position on the slopes of the Buchberg. The charge enjoyed incredible momentum. Sure, the Prussians suffered heavy artillery and musket fire from the Austrians, but they were bloodthirsty. They pushed the Austrian infantry back onto the slopes of the Buchberg before pushing them into the forest altogether. In addition, they seized several Austrian artillery pieces. But because Janusz enjoyed numerical superiority, he had a trick up his sleeve. His Grenzer battalions, to the Prussian right, were in an ideal position to flank the ever-advancing infantry.
Oh
They
no.
did so, drawing their sabers and
Ugh. The flank, the oldest trick in the book. But yeah, that goes to show just the power of numerical superiority, right?
charging into the Prussian lines. Meanwhile, his remaining artillery fired volleys of grape shot. This tore into the infantry lines. Brief, ferocious combat ensued. As the reports from the General Staff indicate, the unusual sight had immediate effect on the morale of the Prussians. Their lines wavered, they yielded ground and became dispersed. The combination of grape shot, the flanking, and close combat in the tree line mauled the infantry. Before too long, the Prussian lines broke entirely, and the surviving infantry soldiers retreated, suffering fire along the way. Because the Prussian infantry body deteriorated into chaos, several units fled in the wrong direction. In total, the Prussians lost 1,337 men and 30 officers. The Austrians captured most of them. Among them was an entire battalion, which ended up surrounded and forced to surrender. The Austrians
They only lost 96 guys? Not even 100. That's a disaster.
lost 3 officers and 96 men. The Battle of London.
Yeah, that was a complete disaster. Oh my, and again, the Prussians have been routed. Before, they were really infamous for not fully being routed, right? Like it's kind of like destroying their myth of invincibility in a sense. The Austrians are really dismantling that. And man, they're just suffering major L's. That's the thing about the whole situation. Like, this is really Prussia's darkest moment right now, right?
Landeshut was nothing more than a footnote, if that, in literature about the 7 Years' War. But it perfectly illustrates the trouble for Prussia during this conflict. Even if they enjoyed momentum, they generally were outnumbered. The aftermath of the battle was emblematic for the Silesian and Bohemian campaign of the 7 Years' War. Prussia's defeat ensured the Austrians were free to use the strongholds along the Silesian border to conduct raids into the province. Janusz was promoted to Major General for his victory. It wasn't until midwinter that Frederick was able to mount an adequate response to the Austrian presence on his frontier. But for now, more pressing issues captured his attention. In the west, the French and Rijksarmee were preparing to link up and attack Prussia. And in the east, the Russians too had learned of the Prussian defeat at Kolin, and their enormous invasion force was rapidly gaining ground. The heavily outnumbered Field Marshal Lewald was the only one standing in between Field Marshal Apraksin's Russians and the entire Duchy of Prussia. At the famous Battle
Yeah, no pressure, dude.
of Groß-Jägersdorf, they would decide the future of Prussia's east.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Yeah, no pressure, bro. You just gotta defend all of like Prussia, at least the duchy and whatnot, from the Russians who are known for their giant armies. Like, oh my goodness. That's a bad position to be in. This dude was like 60, right? Late 60s something. Alright, old timer. Show me what you've got.
In the summer of 1757, things were not looking good for Prussia. Its King Frederick the Great often wondered if his participation in what would become known as the 7 Years' War had been the greatest mistake of his life. After the costly victory of the Battle of Prague, Prussia suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of a much larger Austrian army at Kolin. In the aftermath of Kolin, Frederick retreated to Silesia and Saxony in an attempt to hold the frontiers there. The theaters of war during this time can be roughly divided into 3 parts. A large French army and the Rijksarmee threatened Prussia's western flank. In July, a combined Hanoverian Hessian army under the Duke of Cumberland was defeated by General d'Estrées, opening the way to Brandenburg and Saxony. To the south, the Austrian army under Field Marshal Daun and Prince Charles of Lorraine threatened Prussia's heartland, not to mention the constant raids by irregulars against towns and villages. This was exemplified by the defeat of a Prussian army at Landeshut. Though not a decisive monumental battle, it illustrated Prussia's problem. They were nearly always heavily outnumbered. But through it all, the most significant problem logistics-wise was East Prussia. The duchy was separated by over 300 miles, around 500 kilometers, of Polish territory. Moreover, because of Russia's lukewarm feelings towards the French and British and their abysmal supply line infrastructure. The conflict on Prussia's eastern frontier had not yet escalated to combat. Frankly, the Eastern Front had been dormant so far, but news of the defeat at Kolin also reached the east, and things began moving. The Russians learned of Prussia's recent defeat and sent 2 armies to the duchy. 18,000 soldiers under Count William Firmer laid siege to Memel. Another army numbering some 70,000 under Field Marshal Stepan Arpraxin crossed the Niemen River, slowly advancing towards Wehlau. The Russian army, especially its Cossacks, were notorious for its plunderings and general disobedience. The invasion was no exception. In early July,
Again, these numbers are insane. Prussia is outnumbered, and now they're facing... And so far, the numerical superiority of their foes have allowed them to overcome multiple times. And now they're facing Russia, which is well known for its numerical... its numerical power. Like, the Russians are known for their manpower. So, already, that's, like, this is, like, the worst trade up ever, and Frederick isn't even leading himself. This is gonna be under the leadership of, I'm assuming, someone else he sent. The old guy, I think? I forgot his name. But, that's already iffy. But, like I said, these conditions are not optimal. But, he's... Man. We're gonna see, man. We're gonna have to see.
Firmer captured Memel, establishing the main supply base and departing to link up with Apraxin. The first reports of Cossack plunderings reached Frederick on July 17. At the looming danger in the west and south to worry about, and ordered the heavily outnumbered 70-year-old Field Marshal Hans von Lewald to hold the duchy with 25,000 soldiers.
Lewald, man. Lewald? He is the only man who can hold it down. He's old, he's outnumbered, he's against almost... These odds seem almost insurmountable. But man, we're gonna see, man. Like I said, show me what you got, old-timer.
The king wasn't too worried that unruly bunch would stand no chance against the disciplined Prussians. Additionally, the Russian supply lines were stretched beyond what could reasonably maintain an army. As a result, tens of thousands of soldiers were foraging the woods and plundering villages, but marauders were not. Fact of the matter was that the Russians advanced against the Prussians. In late August, Apraxin continued his advance against Lewald, stationed at Wehlau. Lewald received no specific orders, only to face the Russian army as he saw fit. Historians mention his advanced age. and his inexperience as an autonomous commander. But
Oh boy, that makes it even worse. Like, he's never been autonomous, and he's old. Oh man. I know I keep dissing his age, but like, again, like, you know, we've seen older commanders who are great, and I'm sure he's pretty awesome. Hopefully, we'll see. But it's just that is a disadvantage, though, you know. And I wouldn't be so worried about his age, mainly if it wasn't for just now that he just told me, if it wasn't just for the fact that he's so outnumbered, and now apparently he's not that experienced with being on his own. Like, those two factors mainly worry me the most. But if there is any silver lining to all this, the Russians, apparently their supply line is already extended, which means that as they're foraging, they could probably be more divided and taken out. Also the discipline. Yeah, Prussia has more disciplined soldiers. I mean, granted, we don't know much about the Russians other than he just said that they like to, like, break off to go and pillage, so I guess there's a lack of discipline there, but we'll see in the heat of battle. But yeah, again, well, we'll see.
But given these facts, it makes it all the more surprising what happened next. Because due to some rapid and unexpected maneuvering, the Prussian army surprised the Russians between the villages of Groß-Jägersdorf and Norkit.
Oh.
On the evening of August 29, Lewald and his army arrived nearby the village of Puschdorf. They set up camp between the village and the woodlands, but not for long. That night, the Prussians prepared a march against the Russians in what would hopefully culminate in a deadly surprise attack. Lewald commanded approximately 25,000 to 27,700 soldiers, 17,000 infantry in 22 battalions, 8,200 horsemen in 50 squadrons, and 55 artillery pieces. Field Marshal Stepan Apraksin commanded at least double that. Sources differ a little bit, but it is generally assumed he commanded between 55,000 and 75,000 soldiers. At least 36,200 infantry, 18,600 cavalry, and 263 guns.
Insane.
The Russians camped between Uzbunsen and around the Pregal near Norkitten. Their surroundings consisted of marshes and woodlands. The Russians outnumbered the Prussians at least 2 to 1. At around 2 a.m. that day, unbeknownst to them, Lewald ordered the entire Prussian army to march in 3 columns through the woodlands towards Groß-Jägersdorf. The Duke of Holstein commanded the south, Lieutenant General Schorlemer the north, and Lewald the center. Despite hoping to surprise the Russians, there is reason to assume Apraksin could have prepared for the Prussian attack with the knowledge of hindsight. His Cossack scouts had already informed him of the advancing Prussians in late August. However, because of the lack of deployed guards, the advancing Prussian army wasn't spotted, and the situation didn't put the Russians on high alert. At 4 a.m., a mist...
Okay, so at least it seems like the main advantage Lewald has is that his enemy is not vigilant enough against him. So this might culminate into a surprise attack. Okay.
The dawn, the Russian soldiers slowly awoke and began preparing for their march. The Russian cavalry and Cossacks moved from their camp at Uzbunsen down south, along the road towards Allenburg. Firmer's division was delayed, resulting in only half of the Russian cavalry moving south. To the west, Lewald's army advanced. When he saw the Russian cavalry trekking south, he ordered the Duke of Holstein with 20 whole squadrons to move against the vanguard. Next, he ordered Lieutenant General Schorlemer's cavalry to move towards Weinoten in the north. If successful, the Prussians would mount a surprise attack against both the north and southern flank. Lewald maintained command of the Prussian army, covering the entire center. They deployed in front of Groß-Jägersdorf and Uderballen. Thanks to the morning fog, the Russians overlooked the advancing Prussians at first. A Russian battery nearby Weinoten was the first to notice Schorlemer's advancing cavalry. They opened fire, alerting their comrades that battle was likely imminent. However, upon hearing the noise, several units collapsed in disorder as their officers.
Okay, so Leivold, I like his plan. Essentially, he's had the advantage of catching the Russians off guard, and he's attacking from two sides to quickly disarray, probably divide them. So overall, yeah, I do like the way he's approaching this. I think he is... I just do really like the way he's going about this, you know?
Officers frantically sought to deploy. Frankly, it already was chaos as the Prussian infantry appeared in front of the marching column. The Prussian infantry and cavalry soon fought against haphazardly formed Russian vanguards. They pressed the attack and aggressively pushed into their lines. Eyewitness accounts survive of Russian officers caught by total surprise. Some of them galloped around distractedly, shrieking out meaningless orders. Regular soldiers supposedly left the battlefield to go guard the baggage train or to hang around in nearby bushes. Because general control lacked, many infantry units could not form up in squares, a traditional defense against attacking cavalry. The Prussians made serious inroads in record time. Things were not looking good for the Russians. But to the south, Sibylski's cavalry managed to form a battle line against Holstein's advancing cavalry. Still, Holstein's dragoons launched a severe charge and burst through the enemy lines. Brutal fighting broke out. And to the north, despite the initial surprising casualties, the Russians held Schorlemer's cavalry at bay. However, this promising position for the Russians was radically altered when Firmer ordered the advanced batteries in the north to retreat. There's no satisfactory explanation for why he gave this order, but it directly freed up Schorlemer's 30 cavalry squadrons. These cavalry squadrons now flung themselves at Firmer's cavalry despite the artillery battering.
It's currently 1 a.m. and I'm crazy.
Casualties mounted. To their south, the Prussian infantry continued making inroads against the Russians. Fighting slowly moved into the Norrkitten Wald. But despite the Prussian discipline and their advantage of surprise, it gradually became evident reserves plugged the holes with relative ease.
It's that manpower thing, like, they're so outnumbered, you know? And it keeps, like... It keeps coming back. The manpower. Prussia might have momentum, they might have discipline. And again, we've seen numerical superiority isn't everything. There are times armies have easily defeated, well not easily, but you know, have overcome odds many times. It's just like, at this point, it still is a huge advantage, and there are times armies just couldn't. And Prussia, as of late, hasn't been able to overcome like numerical superiority, and the Russians just have that in spades. So once it comes down, once the initial shock and surprise dies down a little, it comes down to just a fight, and the Russians can just keep going. So yeah.
This also became noticeable to the south. Holstein's dragoons lost 55 men. Despite inflicting many more casualties, it put them on the back foot. The other cavalry units too lost significant numbers, sometimes up to half their strength. They battered the Russians, but their numerical disadvantage showed. Meanwhile, nearby Norrkitten, General Pyotr Rumyantsev managed to rally his infantry. Using them as reserves, they charged through the forest against the Prussian infantry. The combat slowly began moving in the opposite direction, outside the woods. The Russians returned fire perhaps a fraction of the time, but the volume of volleys still tore into the Prussian ranks. The battlefield was cluttered and chaotic thanks to artillery shelling from both sides. Eyewitness accounts mention blinding smoke. During the skirmish, a Prussian regiment accidentally fired into its front lines. Many men were lost. Then on the south, the Russian cavalry seemingly broke. They were routed, and Holstein's dragoons chased them using the momentum. Would Prussia finally break through? Well, certainly not in the way they expected. It was our rules. The Cossacks feigned retreat as Holstein's dragoons chased them past Uzbunsen. Suddenly, they ran into Sibylski's heavy guns. They mauled the Prussian cavalry, and as the Russian infantry closed off their only escape, they surrendered. They were...
Dang, dude. That was a genius ploy from the Cossacks. My goodness. Everything is starting... Things are now... You feel the momentum shift, right? Like, where the Prussians off the bat, seemingly like they had to just great advantage through surprise and discipline, and now it's starting to wane as the Russians are just, now that they're adjusting to the fight and they just have the manpower reserves to just keep going, you know?
Were captured almost to a man. This happened around 6 a.m. Fighting continued until approximately 7 a.m. The battle lines remained somewhat the same. The decisive combats occurred around the center where the Prussian infantry and Russians heavily clashed. Still, despite causing many more casualties, the holes were plugged with reserves. For example, an infantry unit broke through the Russian ranks but lost 489 men and 16 officers. Because of the lack of follow-up, the heavily battered unit had to pull back again. As more Russians began forming up and resisting the Prussians, Leybold understood further attacks would disproportionately affect his men, so he ordered the general retreat. In total, the Prussians suffered between 5,000 and 6,000 casualties. Sources indicate 1,452 dead and 4,502 wounded, although the number of wounded soldiers seems to be inflated. Among them were 282 officers. They also lost 17 battalion guns and 11 big guns. The Russians suffered between 5,000 and 7,000 casualties, at least 1,818 dead and 2,800 wounded. Among them were 11 generals, a surprisingly high number.
I think it is worth briefly reflecting on the battle and its implications. First, the Prussians managed to closely contest an army twice their size. They surprised the entire army, and initially it seemed like they would emerge victoriously. But we should also not forget that the Russians still managed to come out on top, despite a surprise attack, fundamental lack of discipline, and an absence of drilling. Sure,
it's impressive on both sides. It's impressive towards the Prussians of the damage they managed to inflict and showing that they can go out fighting, but at the same time, the Russians also rebounded really well from, multiple disadvantages, such as the surprise and whatnot. So again, it's very it's really telling of both sides' strengths there, I think.
their numerical superiority played an essential part in the eventual victory, but still, they had no opportunity to form conventional battle lines, for example. Redmond explains how the Europeans did not know much about Russian warfare at this time. Besides Sweden wars the previous century, their next best source were the Ottomans, which did not exactly provide the average European commander with much knowledge. Simply put, the Prussians had no idea what to expect, and they misjudged Russian tenacity. This is something that caught me personally somewhat by surprise, but it makes total sense. During the early and middle 18th century, there indeed must have been an absence of knowledge about the Russian warfare and army and their battle tactics. As for Gross-Jägersdorf's aftermath, for the Russians, the most logical course of action would be to continue for 50 more kilometers and seize Königgrätz, the duchy's capital. This move would certainly amputate one of Prussia's safeguards, and it would open the way to its heartland. However, the opposite happened. It was a blessing for Frederick, one that is inexplicable. There would be several more of these strange, inexplicable events during the entire war. Because whether it was because of a false report of the death of the Tsarina, the complete lack of supply lines, local uprisings against the marauding Russians, or an epidemic of smallpox among his soldiers, all that we know is that Apraxin did not follow up his victory. After the victory of Gross-Jägersdorf, the Russians retreated from the duchy. Unfortunately for Apraxin, the Tsarina had not passed away. When she learned of his rather random retreat, she relieved him from command and investigated the Chancellor, supposedly supporting the retreat, for treason. As a result, the Chancellor, Alexei Bestujev-Ryumin, was exiled to his estates. The Tsarina appointed the new Russian commander, William Fermor. This new commander would give Prussia much more of a run for its money, and as the other parties of the war learned of Prussia's defeat, things began heating up in Central Europe.
Talk about luck. At least in terms that Prussia had a bit of breathing breathing room after that, because if the Russians had probably moved quicker and could have moved quicker to immediately capitalize on that, like there's a chance that the duchy would have been even in a worse position, right? So again, like I've heard of Frederick's luck, and it's kind of cool to start seeing that, because like I've heard, yeah, he's great, but he's also lucky, and I'm like, cool, I can see that now. Yeah.
With 19 hotel brands.
The 18th century was not known for its rapid communication. During the 7 Years' War, this was no different. By early September, Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, was still oblivious to Field Marshal Hans von Lewald's defeat at the Battle of Groß-Jägersdorf over a week earlier. In fact, the spirits in the Prussian camp are described as being pretty optimistic during this time. But the war was dragging on, and frankly, Prussia's position was anything but to be happy about. At this stage of the war, there were roughly 3 fronts Prussia had to consider. The Russians were a source for worry in the east, although frankly after Groß-Jägersdorf they did not follow up their victory and left the Duchy of Prussia alone. To the south, the Austrians pestered the Silesian and Saxon frontiers, and to the west, the French and Imperial Army were becoming a major worry for the Prussian king. In July at Hastenbeck, the Duke of Cumberland suffered a defeat against the French army. This freed the French and Imperial Army to link up and move against Prussia's western border. As for the Saxon-Silesian front, we left it right after Prussia's defeat at Landeshut in early August. The door to Silesia was left wide open. The strategic situation was roughly as follows. Habsburg commanders Nadashti, Beck and Arenberg, among many others, roamed the Silesian frontier. The Duke of Brunswick-Bevern, assisted by General Winterfeld, held the gateways to Silesia with some 40,000 soldiers around Görlitz. He was to report any severe incursions against the Silesian territory as soon as they happened. To the west, the defeat at Hastenbeck led to negotiations between France and Hanover. These negotiations would eventually result in the Convention of Klosterzeven, leading to Hanover's withdrawal from the war and partial occupation by France. The convention wasn't signed until September 10, but by late August the writing was already on the wall. At Dresden, Frederick, Keith and Moritz planned accordingly. Since their Hanoverian allies would soon be of no use, they prepared for a march against the combined French Imperial Army in the west. If that army linked up with the Austrians, it would all be over. This was their only hope, to save Prussia's western flank, and with it, its existence. They commanded some 25.
Yeah, it's time to lock in, right? Yeah, this is like the direst of moments, I feel like. No wonder the objective was survive, like, freaking Prussia is fighting to exist at this point, man.
1,000 soldiers, a vastly inferior number to the French imperial armies. In Bohemia to the east, besides the commanders of irregulars, Field Marshal Daun commanded around 75,000 soldiers. Being a notoriously cautious and patient commander, he mainly roamed around in friendly territory, attempting to find an opening into the Silesian heartland. For weeks, skirmishes continued along the entire frontier, but none of them proved decisive, nor did any of them seduce the other side to engage in a large-scale battle. Not for a lack of trying on Prussia's side, by the way, but the Austrian commanders understood they enjoyed a numerical and supply superiority. Time was on their side. There was no reason to engage in a major battle. For example, the Austrian army was firmly entrenched in Zittau. There was no reason for them to move, and for Prussia it was impossible to launch any type of assault. As they sustained constant harassment by irregulars, the relationship between Bevern and Winterfeld was nothing to write home about. Frederick purposefully left Winterfeld together with Bevern as the aging duke did not have the king's complete confidence. This dynamic caused embarrassment for Bevern and annoyance for Winterfeld, who did not like the fact his superior impeded his autonomy. The Prussian army was roughly split in two with this dynamic in mind. Bevern commanded 30,000 soldiers holding the strategically well-fortified Görlitz. Winterfeld commanded some 10,000 soldiers on the right bank of the Neisse River, nearby Moys. They were close to each other, very close, but they were still separate. In Vienna, the lack of initiative by Prince Charles and Dawn rubbed Maria Theresa the wrong way ever since the war had broken out. In late August, she sent one of her many letters to Prince Charles, goading him into action. He had to retake Silesia, especially now that Frederick was preoccupied in the west. Unbeknownst to her, recent developments highly played in their favor. It spurred Charles to take action finally. Nadashti seized a strategic position near Seidenberg, close to Winterfeld's encampment. The time was right not just to enter Silesia, but hopefully seize the entire province and push through Saxony and perhaps even Brandenburg. If done correctly, they could decapitate Prussia. They could, at least, sever its limbs. On the morning of September 7, Prince Charles ordered Nadashti to move into Silesia along the right bank of the Neisse. Dawn, commanding the main Austrian army, followed him closely in case things went wrong.
To the west of the Neisse lay Görlitz, where most of the Prussian army, some 30,000 soldiers, camped. A wooden bridge over the Neisse connected Görlitz and Moys. At Moys, Winterfeld's 10,000-strong corps camped. On the morning of September 7, Nadashti reached the vicinity of Moys. He commanded between 20 and 26,000 soldiers, including artillery. 5,000 of them were cavalry, and a few thousand were irregulars, mainly Croats and Hungarians. Winterfeld's soldiers were outnumbered at least 2 to 1. The Austrians swiftly expelled some outposts at Hermsdorf and Leopoldshain. That morning, Winterfeld was absent. He likely was in a meeting with Bevern across the Neisse. The fact the commander was absent, as the Prussian scouts noticed Nadashti's numerous army approach from the southeast, could have impeded the deployment stages of many armies with a centralized command structure at the time. But thanks to Frederick's military reforms, many Prussian units acted autonomously. When the scouts warned them of the approaching army, they took their positions accordingly. General von Zieten commanded the left wing of the Prussian army, consisting of 35 squadrons of cavalry and 8 battalions of infantry. 2,000 Prussian grenadiers stood on the slope of the Jakobsberg in front of Moys, to the southeast of the main army. The remainder of the army was positioned on Moys's outskirts. The Austrians divided their army in 2 parts. On the right, they occupied Hermsdorf and Leopoldshain. The left,
Somebody is ready for a...
commanded by Arenberg, preyed on the Jakobsberg. To the south of Moys, 2 Hussar regiments roamed around looking for an opening. Nadashti's order to open artillery fire from the hill north of Tilitz marked the start of the battle. At 6 a.m., an enormous bombardment erupted. After briefly battering the Prussian lines, the Duke of Arenberg launched his attack. Commanding 6 companies, they marched uphill through the plain against the Prussians, who were hastily taking their positions. Additionally, some 1,000 Croat irregulars joined the advance. They stormed the Jakobsberg. The Prussians and Austrians heavily clashed on the slopes of the hill. Despite their numerical inferiority, Prussian tenacity initially showed. The Austrians, scaling slopes, engaged in heavy close combat with the Prussians. These managed to maintain control of the battlefield and halt the Austrian advance. Firing their characteristic volleys, they tore into the Austrian lines, inflicting significant casualties. When the smoke cleared, the first wave of Austrians retreated. The attack was repelled. For now, Winterfeld heard noise of battle from a distance. Around this time, he likely also learned the Prussians' outposts had been expelled by a much larger force. He deduced this wasn't just a slight skirmish, but in fact a major assault. So he rallied as many men as he could, and with some 5 battalions he returned to Moys. Nadashti ordered a renewed assault, this time with more soldiers. Significantly outnumbering the Prussians, the Austrians moved forward against the Prussian vanguard. Duke Arenberg, on the left, again launched an attack.
Yeah, I think the Austrians are really just going for they're aware of their logistical and numerical superiority, and I think they're just going, to just straight up use it. They're like, well, we have way more, we can eventually wither them down, probably, and, they're just, for the most part, just going for it and hoping to brute force this, right? Which so far has been working against the Prussians. It seems like their weakness is just their numerical inferiority against their enemies. But, we'll see how this battle does.
Against the Jakobsberg. The remainder of the infantry marched against the Langeberg in front of Moys. The Prussians on the Langeberg launched volley after volley. The artillery tore up the Austrian lines, but around the Jakobsberg, slowly the Austrians pushed the Prussians up the mountain. This continued until Arenberg's vanguard reached the outskirts of Moys. Around this time, Winterfeld arrived. He found a scattered and cluttered battlefield, chaotic, with his troops pushed back by the much more numerous Austrians. On the Landberg, savage hand-to-hand combat erupted. Whereas the Austrians initially enjoyed an advantage, now Winterfeld's fresh battalions pushed back the attack. But their advantage was short-lived. Nadashdy urged on the attack, and 22 additional cavalry squadrons and infantry joined the fight. Winterfeld understood he didn't stand a chance against the numerically superior army. Messengers rushed to and fro Bevern's camp, requesting reinforcements. But these
again, like, it seems like everyone has found the perfect counter to Prussia. It doesn't matter if the Prussian soldiers are better or more disciplined. Numerical superiority can eventually wither them down, and this seems to be the weakness of the Prussians.
reinforcements never arrived. Combat continued for about an hour, but it was clear the Austrians were pushing into the Prussian lines. During a counterattack, Winterfeld was struck by a bullet in his spine.
Oh.
Eyewitness accounts reveal Winterfeld spent his last moments alive, giving orders to his subordinates. He remained conscious until the end. After a few hours of heavy, close-quarter combat, Nadashdy finally enjoyed part of his vanguard in a strategic position on the rises. He used his numerical superiority. Part of his army managed to circumvent the Prussians around the Jakobsberg. They attacked the Prussian lines from the flank.
The flank, the oldest trick in the book!
Effort, but Nadashdy held enough reserves to quickly nip this in the bud. At around 1:30 p.m., the Prussians began the retreat over the bridge towards Görlitz. By this time, the severity of the situation dawned on the commanders there. Prussian batteries across the Neisse ensured the Austrians couldn't pursue the retreating Prussians. Then again, the Austrians didn't want to. They were more than happy with their victory. The Battle of Moys is a footnote of the 7 Years' War, but the casualties and especially the subsequent events tell another story. The Prussians lost some 2,000 men, with severe losses among several battalions. The 41st Infantry defending the Jakobsberg, for example, lost 204 dead and 68 wounded by the end of the battle. The 21st Infantry lost 376 men. Among the casualties were 51 officers and General Winterfeld. Meanwhile, the Austrians suffered around 1,500 casualties, both killed and wounded, 79 officers, around 1,300 wounded, and 200 dead or missing.
Oh boy.
It is briefly worth reflecting on why Bevern didn't send any reinforcements to support Winterfeld. Redman rightly argues that the personal animosity between the commanders is not enough reason. It indeed isn't. Perhaps Bevern wrongly believed Winterfeld was winning the battle, or that the situation wasn't as serious as it actually was. Credible primary sources did not survive the test of time, if they ever existed at all. All that is known is that there's no denying more could have been done to save Winterfeld's army. Now, bad news quickly followed each other up. So firstly, Frederick learned of Lewald's defeat at Groß-Jägersdorf. That same day, the Convention of Klooster-Zeven was signed, confirming Hanover's withdrawal from the war. The same week, the Swedish army landed in Pomerania. But, perhaps most importantly, Bevern decided to retreat deeper into Silesia because of the defeat. During his retreat, irregulars commanded by General Beck harassed him along the way. Bevern's withdrawal would have far-reaching consequences for the course of the war. Frederick initially was none the wiser about Winterfeld's death. A letter from September 14, 1757 survives. In it, Frederick writes to Winterfeld, "Everything is going splendidly here, but I am very worried by a rumor which has come to me from Lusatia. I don't know what to make of it. They write me from Dresden that you have been killed, but from Berlin that you received a minor cut in the shoulder." Frederick ended up learning the truth shortly thereafter. Winterfeld's death impacted him, much more so than Schwerin's. Duffy writes that toward the end of his life, he was discussing the Battle of Moys, when he burst out. "That was where Winterfeld was killed. He was a good man, a man of soul. He was my friend." His great eyes brimmed with tears as he looked towards the window. He opened the casement and stood there some time before he turned back to Reichel and sent him on his way with a perceptible softening in his voice. "Good night. I am obliged to you." As for
Man, dude, all these L's Frederick is taking is insane to me. Like, Prussia is taking so many L's, it's a miracle that they end up coming out the way they do well. Or at least surviving, you know? Yeah.
Winterfeld's remains, they were returned to Prussia 2 days after the battle under the flag of a truce. The next few weeks, Bevern's army was chased by 90,000 Austrians, and in the west, trouble continued brewing as well. There was no end in sight for Prussia's war on multiple fronts. The next decisive moment would be the Battle of Rosbach, where Prussia's future and its existence would be decided.
Those who answer the call of the vagabond.
Late summer 1757, the initial campaigning of the 7 Years' War was over. It did not look good for Prussia's King Frederick the Great. Despite a promising start, the Prussian army and its Hanoverian ally lost multiple battles. Optimism crumbled as enemies encroached on Prussia's territory from the north, the south, the east and the west. All the while, the Prussian army suffered enormous losses. The king knew all too well what was at stake. The entire existence of his kingdom was hanging by a thread. In a final desperate maneuver, Frederick took part of his army outnumbered 2-1 against the combined French Imperial Army. If he lost, it would all be over. The subsequent events culminated in what Christopher Clark describes as Frederick the Great's single most impressive victory.
Dang. Okay. So Frederick is gonna gamble it all, and I guess this is where the turnaround finally starts to happen, because up to this point, Frederick has been taking major L's, major losses. So I'm guessing this has to be the deciding turnabout moment, right, of the war?
The late summer months of 1757 held nothing but bad news for the Prussians. In early September, Frederick learned of Field Marshal Hans von Lewald's defeat at Groß-Jägersdorf. The subsequent defeat at the Battle of Moys and the death of his cherished friend, General von Winterfeld, crushed the king. Bevern retreated to Breslau, where the Silesian front stagnated until November. 3 days after Moys, Hanover and France concluded the Convention of Klosterzeven. It led to Hanover's withdrawal from the war. It opened Prussia's western flank to a combined French imperial army commanded by Prince de Soubise and Prince Joseph Friedrich von Sachsen-Hildenburghausen. To the north, the Swedes, led by Baron Matthias von Ungern-Sternberg, finally landed in Stralsund on September 13, although the Baron was delayed by 4 weeks. Their navy blockaded Stettin, not an ideal position for Prussia, but intelligence told Frederick the Swedes weren't eager to conduct an invasion of Prussia's heartland. Instead, they conducted sieges against Pomerania's strongholds, and that was it. The Reichsarmee, the imperial army, wasn't the leading cause for worry either. Comprised of soldiers from many imperial states, 231 political bodies, every house sent its commanders, challenging to work together and heavily decentralized, with the field marshal maintaining feeble control. The army's efficiency is still debated. On August 30, Frederick arrived at Dresden. Here, Keith maintained a force of some 25,000 soldiers who retreated from Bohemia. These were in poor shape, battered by the constant harassment by irregulars and the elements wearing them down. Frankly, Prussia's army was so weakened that Frederick resorted to deceptive measures to prevent an all-out invasion. For example, the names of Prussian regiments were changed when they moved quarters to confuse enemy spies and inflate their numbers. The next few weeks saw Frederick move around in Saxony, attempting to force a battle against the roaming Princes Soubise and Hildburghausen. During this, Frederick learned of Winterfeld's death. He wrote to his sister that he was so oppressed with grief that he would rather keep his sadness to himself. He was looking forward to dying sword in hand rather than suffering defeat, followed by the tyrannical rule of his enemies. Sorrow is a century, death is an instant. Already after Kolin, Frederick considered suicide. He now proposed a mutual suicide pact to his sister. Fortunately for him, she reminded him that a great genius like yours finds resources even when all is lost, and it is impossible for this frenzy to continue. His subordinates did not notice Frederick's depression and suicidal tendencies.
Dang. Yeah, I said he's gambling, but it also does seem like there's a bit of a death seeking in there. Like, well, at least I can go out nicely. Like, almost like a bit of expecting to go out and everyone... Man. Again, this is his darkest moment, though. Like, so much loss on all fronts. Personal, militarily, just... You know, it's amazing that he didn't completely break under this pressure.
Aside from the outpouring of letters to his sister, he resolutely conducted his campaign with steadfastness and calm. And fortune sometimes does work in mysterious ways. Around this time, Frederick learned of Apraksin's withdrawal from the Duchy of Prussia, despite the Russian victory at Groß-Jägersdorf. He immediately congratulated Lewald and ordered him to return to Pomerania to defend it against the Swedes. To a contemporary observer, this would not be enough to reinvigorate Prussia. To illustrate the threat the kingdom's existence hung by, on October 16, a 3,400-strong Austrian flying corps under General Hadik managed to raid Berlin. They faced barely any opposition. Clearly unable to hold the city, they demanded a hefty ransom before leaving the next day. This news was met by Frederick splitting up his army, dispatching Moritz to relieve the capital before moving in that direction. Keith maintained the western frontier, but due to the slow communication at the time, Frederick learned of Hadik's departure 3 days too late, so he turned his army around, returning to Torgau. Moving like this did not exactly improve the army's morale. The soldiers are greatly fatigued, as it has rained constantly since we left Dresden, and the roads are extremely bad. Many of the Saxons incorporated into the Prussian troops have deserted, but this is no real loss. Frederick still assessed Prussia's survival depended on him preventing the French Imperial and Austrian armies from linking up. From Leipzig, Keith reported the French Imperial army linked up nearby them at Müchel. This was his chance. He rallied his army at Leipzig. Conducting any campaign with this army would be tough, even for the greatest of commanders. To illustrate, Moritz's army had just 5 days to march from Berlin, and Ferdinand's army just 3 from Magdeburg. However, sources reveal what is the most surprising and pleasing at the same time is the spirit the soldiers showed on this occasion. They had marched upwards of 25 English miles a day for 3 or 5 days successively, and at the moment they arrived, they desired to be led into battle against the enemy. Frederick could not pinpoint the exact location of the enemy, but prepared his army for an inevitable battle. On November 3rd, Frederick arrived at Weissenfels. A letter he wrote reveals, "The enemy is assembling troops opposite of me. From my window I can see all his cavalry. The enemy saw him as well." Frederick in person was at the riverbank watching with some frustration as the French burned the covered wooden bridge behind them. 2 enemy officers were watching the royal party from a concealed position on an island which lay within close musket shot range. One of the Frenchmen hastened back to report that it would be possible for a marksman to shoot down a Prussian senior officer, and that this dignitary was probably the king from the respect that was being shown to him. Crillon handed his loyal Brunet a glass of wine and sent him back to his post, remarking that he and his comrades had been put there to observe whether the bridge was burning properly. and not to kill a general who was making reconnaissance, let alone the sacred person of a king, which must always be held in reverence. False intelligence led Frederick to believe his enemy numbered 60,000, outnumbering his force nearly 3-1. This was exaggerated, but the fact Frederick continued to pry for battle just shows how desperate or how confident he was.
In reality, the Prussians found themselves outnumbered around 2-1 by the combined French Imperial Army. The numbers of soldiers participating in the battle are relatively well documented. The Prussians commanded some 16,600 infantry in 20-some battalions, and 5,400 cavalry in between 32 and 45 squadrons, 22,000 men in total, with 79 pieces of artillery. The French Imperial Army commanded 33,770 infantry in 49 battalions and 7,340 cavalry in 40 squadrons, for a total of 41,110 men. They fielded 114 artillery pieces. Of those, 10,900 troops and 45 guns were from the Imperial Army. Frederick positioned his army between the villages of Bedra and Rosbach, some 4 miles removed from where he assumed the French were stationed. The musicians in the French camp revealed their location. All their complements of musicians, trumpeters, drummers, and fifers now gave sound, as if they had won some great victory. Frederick set up headquarters at Rosbach. His brother-in-law, the Duke of Brunswick, commanded the right wing. General von Seydlitz commanded the cavalry. Preceding the battle, a crucial miscalculation in the French camp occurred. Their scouts relayed the Prussians were outnumbered and were likely to flee, whereas Prince de Soubise still wanted to proceed with caution. Prince Joseph Friedrich persuaded him to attack the following day. Meanwhile, in the Prussian camp, Frederick miscalculated as well, but in a more favorable way than his opponents. He figured his enemies were about to retreat and viewed their movements accordingly. The following moment, the French Imperial Army moved to the south in 3 columns. They hoped to outflank the numerically inferior army on their left. The columns moved
relying on the oldest trick in the book.
slow and sluggish, with the French cavalry far in advance. The Count of Saint-Germain and Ernst Gideon von Loudon protected the rear, positioned on the hills south of Mückelen. But this movement only strengthened Frederick's belief they were attempting to retreat. Only when the French turned to the east did he reconsider his assessment. Perhaps they were trying to flank his army. He rapidly switched gears, understanding the gravity of the situation if he allowed his enemies to complete their maneuver. Frederick redeployed his army with incredible speed. First, he dispatched his cavalry under General von Seydlitz. Then he ordered Prince Henry and Ferdinand to lead all his infantry from their positions to the southeast and take a position in front of Reikartswerben and Tagewerben. The cavalry moved to the east past the Janusberg before bending south. The long ridge masked their movements. During this move, the Prussian artillery hastened to deploy on top of the Janusberg. Seydlitz appeared in front of the Imperial cavalry, charging them head-on. Both parties clashed and savage combat ensued. During this charge, the Prussians didn't enjoy much momentum, and the French cavalry soon moved to aid their Imperial comrades. Then the artillery lit up the valley. A deafening bombardment followed, mauling several infantry units.
Okay, so far I'm liking a lot of aspects. Frederick was almost caught off guard, but fortunately his quick thinking and maneuvering is seemingly completely stopping the flanking maneuver. Thank goodness for that, because that would have been a complete disaster.
The arrival of the French cavalry, Seydlitz called in his reserves. These charged head-on against a body of cavalry. Savage close-quarter combat followed. This time, the Prussians enjoyed more success. Their enemy's cavalry began crumbling. They were pushed past Reikartswerben. Around this time, the Prussian infantry vanguard arrived at their destination. The acute angle they positioned themselves in formed the perfect trap for the advancing enemy.
Oh, wow.
Already suffering heavy bombardments, they ran into an awful sight. Their cavalry was mauled to their south. In front of them, the Prussians trapped them. Upon their arrival, the Prussians launched an obliterating volley. Heavily demoralized, part of the infantry barely resisted. The volleys shredded the front lines.
Again, that great positioning from Frederick once again. Wow.
Some of the Imperial infantry dropped their weapons and ran. The French infantry launched a few scattered volleys, but the Prussians did not stop. Because of their
I'm afraid this is where we're gonna have to end the video. Tomorrow we will immediately begin here and get right to how this all turns out. So, I'll see you guys tomorrow.